Good morning and welcome back to our ValueByte series. We are going to get to chat today with Pete, who is an expert in working with multi-generational families, specifically fourth generation families. And so I don't want to steal your thunder, Pete, but we're very excited to have you share your insight about the importance of planning for a transition. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you help businesses and owners.
Well, thanks for having me. I do appreciate it. So my mission, and I don't know if I would have articulated this way when I was 22, but my mission has really always been to help owners create more value for their stakeholders. So with a focus on customers, employees, vendors, the communities that they operate in, my focus has really always been that on that. In the last 20 years or so, I've been working with family-owned businesses and founder-led businesses. And I would say 20 years ago, I caught that family-owned business bug. There's that added dynamic of having family owners involved, whether they're in the business or just working on the business, that makes it spicier, maybe. Think of it that way. Certainly is more challenging and a lot more fun, given that families are really looking at things, looking at their businesses over the long term, like generations. And so I'm working with companies that are 80, 90, 120 years old, and families that want to maintain that legacy.
That is so awesome. I mean, as someone who has worked as a direct employee for a couple of family-owned businesses and experienced some of that spiciness,
Right.
I commend you for focusing on them, because they really do. Even those that have been around for, like you said, decades, they need a lot of help. But what are some common misconceptions or myths that people have about family-owned businesses?
I think the biggest is, we're talking about the spiciness, but the greatest misconception of family-owned businesses is that they are a circus, that it's like what you see on TV. HBO's show Succession.
Oh yeah, that's a
Really,
good show though. That is a good
it
show.
is. Well, and it's so extreme. And certainly there is drama in every business. We're dealing with humans. So
Right.
there's always going to be some drama, and there's a little more drama sometimes, and there's a few more challenges. There's always that crazy uncle that shouldn't be at the party and, is involved in the business in some way. And so, every family has to deal with that. But I think that's the misconception is that it's a day-to-day circus and that they really can't get anything done.
That's fair. I mean, I think that you make a good point in that any business has dynamics, right? And quote unquote drama. But I imagine too, just when you're dealing with generational family businesses and those family-led businesses, there's just a lot of probably additional expectation and maybe even passion and care and commitment that is at a different level than someone that maybe isn't carrying forward 100-year-old tradition. And so I can appreciate the idea that there's certainly similarities. But let's think a little bit about some of the unique challenges. So I imagine that I know that you also work with founder-led businesses, and Pete, you don't just serve generational, but I think your expertise is one that is unique in that you have that background. And so what would you say are some unique challenges that the family-owned businesses face when it comes to transitioning leadership compared to maybe some of the other businesses that you've worked with?
Well, I would say that, there's a lot of common threads between founder-led businesses and family-owned businesses. And the primary thread is that emotional attachment to what is being built, what has been built. For the family-owned businesses, especially as you get to third, fourth, fifth generation, it's the legacy that the family embraces. It's the stories that have been told over generations that the succeeding generations really focus on. And it strengthens their commitment to the business, but sometimes it also clouds judgment. And it makes it more challenging for the company to make sometimes those hard decisions that you have to make, whether it's a people related decision you have to make, or a product that just doesn't fly any longer. There's those challenges that they have that when they're focused on the long term, sometimes they forget about having to take care of business today.
Getting that kind of the tunnel vision aspect and not really thinking about what that day-to-day looks like. That's a really good point. And I mean, I think that's just something that happens with business owners in general. I know, we work with folks that are looking to exit their business, or they have like a major transition, and that emotional side of things, it comes up, right? And I think oftentimes it can be a surprise even to owners. It's like, it's business. There's no crying in business.
Right.
But maybe like,
Right.
okay, maybe like a few tears.
Well, there's tears in a lot of businesses, right? But one of the other things that founders and family-owned business leaders struggle with is the work-life balance. And so when they do go to make that transition, they ask themselves, what am I going to do now? What do I do? I mean, most of my life, so say 20 hours a day, is really focused on this business because I've got that intersection of family and company.
One of the things that we do to help our clients and the business owners we work with to stay on track is to really dive into their vision and their values for the business. How does aligning the family's vision and values help with getting through that transition, maybe even just getting through the day-to-day up to the transition, but then that fourth quarter too, right? The part that you just talked about after the transition. What are some ways that they can use vision and the things that they value to guide them and keep them on track?
I think that's a topic that is probably one of the most important for families to discuss and to work with, because many times I find that family-owned businesses don't have a vision for the family and a vision for the business. And oftentimes the family vision is neglected. People forget that the first generation probably started the business to survive. They were looking for an income. Second generation said, hey, wow, this is interesting. I could make a living doing this as well. And by the time you get to the third and fourth generation, there's a lot of branches on the tree. And so it's important for them to have that discussion about what's important to the family and how does the family business help to deliver on that vision. How do we use the business in order to achieve our family objectives? And so having those conversations about the difference between the family vision and the business vision is super important.
So how do you, when working with owners and family-owned businesses, and even founders to some extent, I'm sure there's still a sentiment, but how do you recommend folks balance the desire to maintain tradition, but also with the need to adapt to modern practices?
I think the short answer is you have to continue to focus on your stakeholders. What's important to my customers? What's important to my employees? What do my vendors require of me, and what can they provide to us? So I think as you progress from generation to generation, we forget about what it took to bring the business to life in the first place. That there was a need in the market, there were customers, the customers needed to be served, and then there's employees that provide those services and so forth, build those products. And as we go from generation to generation, sometimes we forget about that, and we're really more focused on the business as opposed to on why we're in business. And so as we better understand what the needs are for our constituents, then we look to the outside world and say, what tools are out there for us to help us better serve? In many, many cases, there are decades where there's this void of new technology, new ideas, innovation, because they forget about that, right?
Yeah, I think that's such a common problem in family-owned businesses, especially is, that's the way we've always done it
Right.
mentality. It worked for them, it'll work for
Mhm.
us. When you mentioned technology, I thought of a manufacturing
Right.
company I worked with that they were still running everything basically off of like paper books. They didn't have a CRM. It was all
Mhm.
like ledgers and written down. And it was like, this is 2014, guys.
Mhm.
Let's come on up to speed. So I'd love to hear a story about maybe a specific family that you were able to help and what success looked like for them, right? So what were maybe some problems that they had that you were able to help them work through, and get to a point of feeling like they were positioned to transition that business to the next generation, or just get through some sort of internal issue.
Well, you mentioned paper ledgers, so I'll start with that. So I worked with a company that was probably, it was maybe fifth generation, let's call it fifth generation. And what I discovered very quickly was that the second generation had run the company for 60 years
Oh,
with no succession plan. And it was the passion project for this particular owner. And for literally 60 years, he ran the company. And when it came time he skipped over the third generation. When it came time to transition the company to the next generation, the fourth generation said, okay, so what do I do now? I've got this company that was built in the 1930s, was run like a company that was, from the 1950s. And so we had to modernize. And so the biggest challenges they had were there hadn't been any external expertise brought into the business. Everybody that was working there when I first came upon them had been there for 25, 30 years. There was no new technology. Their ERP system was built in 1987, and here it was 2007. And so that wasn't appropriate for the business. And the only thing that they really had, which was super valuable, was very strong relationships with their customers, and the ability to innovate for their customers. But they hadn't innovated on the inside. And so their challenge was, how do we take this company, which has a great reputation in the market and continues to do really good business in the market? How do we modernize it so that it makes more money and it can grow and scale using what money it kicks off, to become even a bigger part of the equation in the industry that they were facing. The one thing that I found to be very interesting was that this owner who had been running the company for 60 years, his philosophy was, when it came to family, it's a privilege to work here, not a right. So as a result, there weren't that many family members working in the business.
Mhm.
And so there was no one to hand the business to, right? So when come the fourth generation brought in after college, after a lot of working outside the company, we work through some of those challenges. And it took a few years to modernize the company from a people perspective, from a people practice perspective, from a technology perspective, from a manufacturing innovation perspective. But we ultimately converted that company from a 1950s oriented kind of business where employees didn't have the same kind of voice in the business as they really should, to a mean, lean fighting machine.
What a great example of how the work that you do coming alongside owners in that family really impacts the legacy. Like, it really goes beyond just the immediate day to day and making those shifts. And I love to just kind of in the story how you really talked about there were still a lot of positive things, right? Like even the relationships with the current clients and that they were innovating externally, and kind of the idea that both of those dichotomies can exist, that
Right.
your perception and your client's experience is innovative, but then you go behind the curtain, right? And it's unveiled that it's like, that doesn't really align.
Mhm.
And I think that's just such a great example of how when we experience kind of in our marketing world of things being misaligned, and that there's an opportunity as we're building and growing, no matter what aspect it is from within the business, to bring those things together to align so that you can start to kind of move everything forward, whatever that end goal
Right.
is, that vision is. So
Well, to put
kind
a
of,
bow, I'm sorry to interrupt you, just to
no,
put a bow on that. We
yeah.
used to always say about that business that it was like going to Disney. From the outside, everything was cool, calm, collected, fun, energetic. It was current, it was modern, it was appropriate. But behind the scenes, you had no idea what was going on to make sure that that happened. How many people were involved, the craziness, the chaos, the uncertainty, the drama that was going on behind the scenes, because they did such a great job of showing up for the customer. And so the goal for that initiative really was to do for the inside of the business what had already been done for the outside of the business.
What a great win for them and for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was a great experience.
Win-win.
For sure.
Well, so as kind of parting thoughts, what would you say would be your top advice for a business that is maybe just starting to think about transitioning leadership, or what that next phase looks like?
It's never too early. I think that's probably the most important thing when it comes to succession is you should start talking about succession long before you anticipate the need for succession. Things happen in people's lives, and so there might be a disruption in the life of the leader of the business, and so you can't plan for that kind of thing. But you also need to start early, knowing that the business is going to need a different type of leader a generation from now, a decade from now, than it has today. There's just practices that I've grown up knowing and are part of my DNA that may not be appropriate for a business that wants to compete in 2030. So starting early, discussing it often, setting expectations, training the next generation to become the next generation leaders is super important. And as part of that, I always recommend that next generation go work somewhere else. Learn how to be an employee on somebody else's dime. Get trained by even going to work for a competitor or a related organization is super helpful, because then they bring that outside perspective. And especially when it's difficult for parents to tell their kids how to behave as an employee, when you're tired of telling them how to behave as a person, right? But start early and communicate often.
I love that. So many great tips and things that apply regardless if someone's looking at a family transition or if they're thinking about selling their business, doing an ESOP, some other sort of exit. And so I really appreciate your time today, Pete. It's been awesome hearing your insights.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So if someone is listening to this and they're thinking, I just always assumed that my kid would take over the business, and now maybe that's not 100% accurate. Where can they connect with you to learn more about how you work and how you can help them with their business?
I think the easiest place to get me is on LinkedIn. Everything's there. So it's, LinkedIn / I think /P3 Palermo is my profile.
Perfect. Well, we will also be sure and link that in our show notes.
Super.
And Pete, thank you again so much for your time today.
All right. Thank you both. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. Thank you.